I'm not racist at all. Yeah, but that's not how racism works. It's not black and white. What do you mean? This is the standard deviation graph. In stats, it's used to show how data spread out. You'll find most of the data points in the middle and the outliers on the side. I've done the same thing for racism, and let's start off with the most common types: gaslighters and colorblind. Gaslighters are convinced that racism no longer exists, or they'll say not everything's about race, even though they hold a bunch of racist stereotypes and beliefs. Colorblind folks have forgotten that if you don't see race, you can't fight racism, and you definitely can't change your own racial biases. Although they don't have hateful hearts, this is usually a cop-out to remain comfortable in your white privilege because you don't see any need for change. The second most common types. White racists try to present themselves as non-racist, but they're just more slick with their racism. They think we don't see them, but in fact, they can't see themselves. A good example of a quiet racist is Amy Cooper. She presented herself as progressive, however, she did something incredibly racist. If you're not sure of her story or if you still don't fully understand the white woman tears concept, I strongly encourage you Google her. Kind heart, uninformed mind. These people are more often than not aware when racism happens. It makes them incredibly uncomfortable. They have a bunch of white guilt. However, their white fragility and reluctance to self-educate is slowing them down. The third least common. Loud racists will shamelessly use racial slurs. They fly the old but dead flag, the Confederate flag, you know what I mean. Well read and too comfy. On paper, they're doing everything right. They're identifying their own racial biases, they're reading all the books, they're calling out the racists, they're buying black. However, sometimes they're just talking too much in the black spaces. Sometimes they center themselves too much. Sometimes they talk over us. Sometimes they talk for us. Sometimes they're too comfortable. And lastly, the extreme outliers. I feel like this is very self-explanatory. They're doing hate crimes, they're part of the KKK. You know exactly who I'm talking about. This demographic uses their privilege for change. They're self-educating to unlearn their own racial biases. However, they don't center themselves. They're not white saviors. And usually the only time you hear them speaking about race and racism is when they're calling out other white people's racism or racial biases. It's important to note that these two demographics will oftentimes use racial slurs and/or say something incredibly racist in private settings. And these two demographics, especially this one, will turn a blind eye when they do it. Just because you don't engage in overt racism does not mean you still don't have any racism or racial biases to work through. Please consider that before you say